Hi, everybody. Brad Truax here from Eastman's Woodlands and Wildlife Committee. And today we're going to talk a little bit about white pines. We did talk about white pines briefly in our previous presentation on conifers of Eastman, but we're going to talk about them in a little more detail today. Once again, the trees and forests are the heart and soul of Eastman. Eastman's founders really designed this community to live within the natural beauty and the features of the land. And our trees don't just provide us with shade, they provide us with life. They provide roosting and nesting habitats for both birds and many mammals. Their wood and their branches and leaves and their nuts and their seeds provide food sources for many wildlife species. And you may not recognize the millions of caterpillars that feast on the tree leaves and in turn are primary food sources for fledgling birds. Woodpeckers feast upon the insects in many dying trees, and the trees provide shelter from the elements for many wildlife species. Trees are also carbon sinks that fight global warming and climate change, and even in death, trees provide new life to emerge. So, in a word, trees really are in Eastman. So Eastman's forests are mixed hardwood conifer forests, and our vibrant fall foliage is due to deciduous trees, but it's the conifers and evergreens that have year-round functions. So the eastern white pine, when we ask what tree symbolizes Eastman, the answer we most often hear is the white pine. And while number-wise, it may not be the most common tree at Eastman, it certainly dominates our overstories and our canopies. And these iconic trees can grow well over 100 feet tall. They have diameters of 2 to 4 feet and girths of 6 to 12 feet, which really make them physically the most impressive trees that we have here. And the crown of an eastern white pine can be 30 to 50 feet wide, so it's pretty substantial. So again, the eastern white pine has had a really rich history in the history of the United States. It's often called the tree that built the United States. And that's because early explorers had noticed these huge pines in what is now eastern Canada and Maine. And England needed those tall, straight pines to build ship nafts for its navy. Uh, England was at war with the French and the Dutch and the Danish, and they were blocking access to some of the Baltic pines that had previously been used for making masts. So the original charters that were granted to colonists by the King of England actually intended to secure white pines for England. White pines shortly thereafter became the central part of the New England economy, and the lumber industry really became the driver of the new U.S. economy. England's efforts to control the white pine industry really led to anger amongst the colonists and ultimately was a huge factor leading to the Revolutionary War. So pretty impressive history of the white pine in relation to the evolution of the United States. So again, people destroyed the old growth pine forests. Extensive lumbering destroyed the pine forests here in New England when that was the driver of the early economy. And then as people moved westward, logging followed them. The white pines were clear cut all the way from Maine to Minnesota, and extensive logging largely destroyed the pine forests. When the railroad was created, it also increased the need for wooden railroad ties and wood for fuel. And by 1910, the pine stands of New England, New York, Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, Minnesota, and Michigan basically were gone. Nature also dealt blows to the eastern white pine. Some seeds that were brought back from England carried a fungal disease called white pine blister rust that was really devastating to the eastern white pines. And when there was a mass exodus from New England to Ohio, there was a resurgence in pine growth. But then the Great Hurricane of 1938 blew down a third of all the pines here in New England. So today you can see many fallen huge moss-covered pines still on the forest floor, pointing to the northwest, which was the direction that the hurricane was headed. And some pine snags that are still standing after that hurricane still today support very much wildlife. But today, the eastern white pines have recolonized much of New England's cleared lands. And fortunately, the eastern white pine is still a big part of life here at Eastman. So again, this map is basically showing the range of the eastern white pine. It goes all the way from Newfoundland, way up here in Canada, along the Appalachian mountain range, down to northernmost part of Georgia, and then out west to Manitoba and Canada and Minnesota and Wisconsin in the United States. And the eastern white pine thrives in cool, humid climates. So the primeval white pines, the ones that were here back before all the settlers came, typically grew well over 200 feet tall. But the tallest today is only about 175 feet, and the tallest here at Eastman is only about 120 feet. But their straight trunks, which often had no branches up to 60 to 80 feet, really made them valuable for ship masts and poles. And once again, their diameters may be 2 to 4 feet, and their girths 6 to 12 feet or more. And a typical crown of an eastern white pine might be up to as wide as 50 feet. So they're also the source of the green pollen that lands on everything in spring or early summer. And they're often considered fast-growing trees. They can actually grow at about a foot a year. And in fact, under ideal circumstances and conditions, they can grow up to 3 feet a year. So they grow best in full sun, but the young trees are relatively shade tolerant and can still grow. And formerly, they used to live as long as 400 years, but today, a lifespan of 50 to 100 years is much more common. They serve as a very valuable resource for wildlife in their needles, their seeds, their cones, the shade they produce, and the nesting sites they produce. So again, here's an eastern white pine. They may grow as tall as 150 feet. They usually tower over all the other species here at Eastman. So again, the highest trees in the canopy, in fact, are the eastern white pines. And the girth can be as much as 10 to 16 feet. The white pine needles are flexible and soft. They come in bundles, also known as fascicles, of 5. And these are about 3 to 5 inches long. And they're kind of a bluish green in color. And the needles usually last about 3 years before they begin to brown and actually drop off the trees. So again, comparing white pine needles versus red pine needles, in both they tend to come in bunches or what we call fascicles. The white pine needles up here at the top come in bundles of 5, whereas the red pine needles come in bundles of 2. And if you bend the red pine needles, they tend to break in half, whereas the white pine needles will not break when you bend them. So again, white pines are evergreens. But that term usually means that the needles are there year-round compared to deciduous trees, which lose their leaves every winter. But in fact, white pines actually do shed their needles. They just shed them every 2 to 4 years rather than shedding them on an annual basis. And because the needles are typically present year-round, white pines are capable of photosynthesis even in the winter, as long as they are getting some sunlight. Young white pine trees have thin, smooth, greenish-brown bark. But then as the tree matures, the white pine bark is cut into roughly rectangular blocks. And again, these are very scaly on the surface. They're about 1 to 2 inches thick. They often have deep crevices between each individual block. And the scales may be covered with moss, fungi, or lichens. There is a difference between the bark of white pine versus red pine. On the top, we're looking at white pine bark. It's kind of a purplish black with some broad ridges that we talked about. On the other hand, the red pine bark down here tends to be more flaky and has some reddish tinges to it. So you may commonly also see some bear claws or bite marks in red pine bark. when we talked about bears. If you're out in the woods and you find an isolated red pine tree, it almost always has some evidence of bear activity. Very interesting. So again, eastern white pine branches grow in whorls. Okay, these are basically rings of branches that grow in a circular pattern around the main trunk. And there's one whorl for each year of growth. So you can actually, if you count the whorls, you can tell how old that pine tree is. Now the whorls will self-prune, so the ones that are down lower will drop off. So you may have to look up higher in the tree to actually see the branches in the whorl pattern. But down below, you will see some knots that indicate where those whorls were initially. So it's very interesting that you can usually tell the age of an eastern white pine simply by counting the knots in the whorls. Eastern white pines were valued for their very tall, straight trunks, but occasionally you might see a eastern white pine where the trunks are bifurcated or even broke off into multiple different trunks. And that's usually the result of the attack of a white pine weevil when that tree was at a very young age. All those pine cones that you see on the ground, those are female pine cones. The female pine cones are long and narrow, about 4 to 8 inches long. The male pine cones, on the other hand, are these small yellow ones that actually open up and release the pollen. So again, when we talk about hard mast, we're usually talking about nuts coming from hardwood or some softwood trees. We usually don't think about conifers when we're discussing hard mast. But in reality, pine cones can be considered hard mast. Many birds like woodpeckers, turkeys, crossbills, and animals like squirrels and even deer do eat pine cones and their seeds. Back in 2024, we had an incredible amount of pine cones. So why were there so many? Well, there was a bumper crop at that time, and our white pines do have mast years, similar to oaks having mast years. And during those mast years, they produce large number of pine cones. And this happens every few years. So 2023 was probably a mast year for the pines, and that's why there were so many pine cones on the ground in 2024. But remember, all those pine cones you see on the ground are female pine cones. They're the ones that produce the seeds. And the male pine cones are those small yellowish ones that grow in clusters and produce the pollen. Squirrels and some birds do feed on those pine cones. And some birds' beaks are actually ideally suited to extract seeds from the pine cones. So, for instance, turkeys and quail rapidly seek and eat pine seeds. Crossbills also like a diet of pine cones. They'll eat the cones of white pine, spruces, and eastern hemlock. And they have a unique bill that actually helps them remove all the seeds in a pine cone basically in minutes. So where does all that pollen come from? Well, the pollen comes from the male pine cones. So up here you're seeing small male pine cones growing a little bit bigger later in the spring. And down at the bottom, you're seeing the results. Once they release all that pollen, it gets all over the place. So here's green pollen that's basically covering this automobile. Sometimes the cloud that's produced by the pollen is really massive. This picture down at the bottom is showing basically a pollen cloud that's over a town in North Carolina. But quite frankly, last spring, when we were driving down to Manchester, there was what looked like a cloud over Manchester. In fact, the cloud turned out to be a pollen cloud. So these really can be very impressive in the springtime, and they're pretty nasty if you have allergies. Okay, so do wildlife species eat the pine cones? Well, squirrels and some birds do feed on the pine cones. And again, we mentioned some birds' beaks are ideally suited to extract those pine cones. So turkeys, quails, and crossbills are the ones that especially like to eat the pine seeds in those pine cones. But red squirrels are very fond of pine seeds, and they often stack piles of pine cones. In fact, there's one red squirrel that once stashed over 50 pounds of pine cones under the hood of a car. Really incredible. The white pine seeds are brown. They often have wings, and they're produced in those 4 to 8 inch female pine cones. They're usually released in late fall, and they're a favorite food of many songbirds and many mammals. So, what's the value of the white pine for wildlife? Well, many birds and squirrels and even deer do eat the seeds in those pine cones. And deer, snowshoe hares, porcupines, and some other mammals will browse on the needles and the bark of the white pine. And beavers, porcupines, rabbits, and mice will consume the bark of the white pine. And the dense foliage and branches can serve as nesting sites or roosting sites and basically shelter from predators for birds and some small mammals. And they provide a habitat for birds and many other cavity nesting wildlife species. They also allow shade tolerant species to grow in the understory, and those other species may have additional value for the wildlife. Dens in hollow pines are warmer and drier and safer than ground dens in winter for many species. So bears, raccoons, and porcupines may den in some hollow pines. Pileated woodpeckers really love dying white pines, and the holes left by those woodpeckers can become homes subsequently for owls, squirrels, and other wildlife. Bats can sometimes live in the crevices where the bark tends to separate. And almost 80% of bald eagle and osprey nests in some areas are actually in white pines. If you remember from our discussion on bald eagles, they like to build their nests in the highest trees. And certainly here in Eastman and much of New England, the highest trees, in fact, are the eastern white pines. Mother bears often plan their activities near white pines, so their cubs can climb up the trees and maybe sleep in them. It's actually that strong, rough bark of the white pines is easiest for the bear cubs to climb up on. Compared to the flaky bark that occurs on some other trees. And those white pines also produce some shade for the cubs on those hot days before the deciduous trees have grown their leaves. So once again, a whole bunch of species of songbirds eat those seeds, and that includes yellow-bellied sapsuckers, black-capped chickadees, white-breasted nuthatches, pine warblers, pine grosbeaks, red crossbills. Multiple mammals also eat the seeds: beavers, squirrels, snowshoe hares, cottontails, porcupines, mice, white-tailed deer. The pine marten gets its name from its association with pine trees. The martens prefer to den and raise their kits in hollow trunks or split branches or abandoned cavities that are naturally found in older, more mature pine trees. So again, they even benefit humans. Molecules called terpenes can cross cell membranes and even get into our brains. And these may benefit our immune system and even fight cancer and some neurological conditions. And forest bathing is a multi-sensory experience, taking in the sights and smells of the forest. And it's been shown to lower people's blood pressure. So forest bathing may have physical, psychological, and spiritual benefits. It's often used in Japan and other areas in the Orient. But there's no question that a good walk in the woods is good for everybody. So why are all those pine needles turning brown? White pine needle blight is actually due to 4 fungal pathogens. It happens after a period of heavy rain in spring, followed by a dry period. But it's actually last year's rain that did this, not this year's rain. So again, you may have seen multiple pines with brown, dead-looking needles, and that's probably white pine needle blight. It's primarily caused by 4 fungal pathogens, and it follows wet weather that occurs in May, June, or July when those white pines are flushing out new growth, and then followed by an area of drought later in the season. And once again, it was last year's rain that triggered it, not this year's rain. And the condition may be increasing due to climate change, because with climate change, we're seeing periods of increased precipitation interspersed with long drought spells. So these pine trees will likely fully recover. But if you have several consecutive years of this phenomenon, it may lead to the pines actually dying. So why don't pines, evergreens freeze? it's, they seem to contain concentrated sugars and proteins that act like an antifreeze. And substances like sugar and jasmonic acid and ethylene lower the freezing point of the sap in their needles and trunks. And water gets moved out of the cells and into the intercellular spaces, and that prevents the cells themselves from bursting due to expanding ice. And the thick, waxy, slender needle-like shape reduces water loss during cold, windy conditions.
In wintertime, the water inside evergreen trees should turn to ice, but it doesn't. Why? Basically, evergreen trees make their own antifreeze through a special combination of natural sugars and antifreeze proteins, which bind to ice crystals inside the plant cells and prevent the ice crystals from growing bigger. This effectively lowers the freezing point, just the way antifreeze works in your car engine. Except this is all natural. Trees need to do all they can to retain water. So that's the reason that evergreen trees like spruce and pine and this little holly have a waxy coating on their leaves to trap moisture and protect these trees from the perils of winter.
So pretty neat. I always wondered why they would be able to survive the winter. So Baltic pines were once used for ship masts, but they had to be joined together for very tall masts. On the other hand, the eastern white pine, they were tall enough and straight enough to build even the tallest, the masts for even the tallest ships. So while wooden ship masts are no longer widely sought, white pine is still very valuable for its wood. The wood is fairly light in weight, and it's durable. It stains very well and finishes well. So it's often used for furniture, cabinets, trim and molding, doors, flooring, paneling. And white pines are also often used for ornamental Christmas trees. Here's one reference I found very fascinating, that interesting relationship that the white pine had to the history of America. So if you want to see a really good YouTube video on that, here's a link to it. So that's a little bit about the eastern white pine. It's a fantastic tree. It's probably the one tree that most people talk about here at Eastman. And now you know a little bit more about them.